A decade ago, we were celebrating the birth of a global justice movement, which could properly be called a globalization movement if that term had not been stolen by powerful sectors, state and private, for whom globalization means a particular form of international economic integration. It's a mixture of liberalization and protectionism in the interests of the designers, not surprisingly, along with drastic provisions to enhance investor rights. These are the natural preferences of those who meet in Davos, the de facto world government run by the masters of the universe, in the words of the business press. The global justice movement, in sharp contrast, seeks authentic globalization, global integration in a much broader sense, and crucially in the interests of people, not narrow concentrations of power. Within the reigning doctrinal system, it is therefore called anti-globalization. The global justice movement has registered some successes in the past decade, most strikingly perhaps in the region where it gained its first large-scale public expression, South America, the site of the earliest meetings of the World Social Forum. In the years since, for the first time since the European conquests, South America has taken significant steps towards the two forms of integration that are essential if the region is to escape the repression and suffering that have been the fate of the vast majority under colonial and neocolonial rule. The first form is integration among the countries themselves, which is a prerequisite for independence. The second is internal. Within each of the societies, the traditional structure has been the rule of a small Europeanized elite enriching themselves and protected from the sea of misery around them. In both respects, the steps towards integration have been halting, but real, encouraging, and potentially quite significant. In the move towards integration, some organizational structure has been taking shape. One example is UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. In September 2008, UNASUR met in Chile to consider the violence that had just erupted in Bolivia as traditional elites, with U.S. backing, of course, sought to regain the power they had lost in the impressive Bolivian elections of December 2005. The UNASUR meeting condemned the massacre of peasants by the quasi-secessionist elements, the traditional rulers, and declared, quoting them, their fullest and decided support for the constitutional government, whose legitimacy had just been even more strongly ratified in the recent referendum. In response, President Morales thanked UNASUR for its support and observed, in his words, that for the first time in South America's history, the countries of our region are deciding how to resolve our own problems without the presence of the United States. That's true, and it's of historic significance. A year later, another UNASUR meeting took place, this time in Ecuador, and in this case under the shadow of renewed U.S. military intervention. Ecuador had expelled the United States from its Manta base in Ecuador, last military base in South America. Washington reacted at once by gaining 6 new military bases in Colombia, its one remaining military ally in the region. President Obama recently added 2 new bases, naval bases, in Panama. semi-colony. UNASUR met again last September and expressed serious concern over these developments. Particular concern was expressed over recently discovered U.S. Air Force documents which explain, actually I'll quote them, explain that the bases would provide the Pentagon with the capacity for full spectrum dominance in almost all of Latin America to respond to the constant threat from narcotics-funded terrorist insurgencies and anti-U.S. governments, and to improve theater security cooperation and expand expeditionary warfare capability. The documents also outline longer-term plans to link these capacities to the Africa Command. That's part of Washington's system of full-spectrum dominance of the entire world. The U.S. also reactivated the Fourth Fleet, which operates in Latin America and Caribbean waters. It had been dismantled 60 years ago. Washington has also sharply increased training of Latin American officers with the mission of combating radical populism. It's a concept that's understood all too well in Latin America. The traditional means of imperial control have been violence and economic strangulation, and these have lost much of their power as a result of moves towards independence in South America and also diversification of the global system. But they have not been abandoned, as these recent developments illustrate. There have been 3 military coups in Latin America in the new century. The first was in Venezuela in 2002. It was quite openly supported by Washington, which had to back off and turn to subversion when the coup was quickly overthrown by a popular uprising. The second military coup was in Haiti, carried out by Haiti's traditional torturers, France and the United States, which spirited the elected president to Central Africa and has sought to bar his return to the hemisphere. And the third was in Honduras just a few weeks ago. In that case, the last case, Obama separated the United States from all of Latin America, almost all of Latin America and Europe, by accepting the military coup, which his administration refused to describe in these terms. Virtually alone, the United States recognized the elections, which were then held under military rule. Obama's ambassador to Honduras, Hugo Lawrence, called the elections a great celebration of democracy. He was echoing Kennedy Johnson, ambassador to Brazil, Lincoln Gordon, after the U.S.-backed military coup in 1964, organized during the Kennedy administration, carried out right after the assassination. That coup instituted the first of the neo-Nazi national security states that spread through the continent, leading to the worst plague of repression in its history. Gordon was very proud of the coup. He exulted that the Brazilian coup was the most decisive victory for freedom in the mid-20th century. And he added that the democratic forces, as he called them, the democratic forces now in charge, should create a greatly improved climate for private investment, much like Honduras, a great celebration of democracy with similar effects. The ties between the Pentagon and the Honduran military are so close, and U.S. aid is so decisive for this virtual client state, that the U.S. could easily have joined Latin America and Europe in defending democracy. But Obama chose to keep to the tradition. Democracy is fine if and only if it accords with U.S. state and corporate power interests. So it's fine in Eastern Europe, at least up to a point, but not in our own domains. The vast majority of U.S. aid to Honduras was never suspended after the coup. In contrast, after recent military coups in Mauritania and Madagascar, aid was immediately suspended. The U.S. also prevented the Organization of American States from adopting a resolution refusing to recognize Honduran elections carried out under the dictatorship, elections that Washington quickly applauded. The coup in Honduras preserves for Washington its Palmarola military base, which was called the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S.-run forces attacking Nicaragua during Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America in the 1980s, and that base is becoming increasingly valuable today as Latin America, especially South America, takes steps towards independence. After the Honduran election, such as it was, Arturo Valenzuela, that's Obama's State Department official in charge of Western Hemisphere affairs, he told the press that the issue is not who is going to be the next president. The Honduran people decided that, choosing between two coup supporters while the elected president was holed up in the Brazilian embassy. Obama's representative to the Organization of American States, meanwhile, instructed the backward Latin American peons that they should join the United States in the real world, abandoning their world of magic realism, and they should recognize the military coup as Big Brother had done. Obama even broke new ground in support for the military coup. There are two government-funded organizations that are supposed to support democracy in the world, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, two political parties. The International Republican Institute regularly supports military coups to overthrow elected governments, most recently in Venezuela in 2002 and Haiti in 2004. But up until now, the National Democratic Institute had held back, including these two cases. In Honduras, for the first time, Obama's National Democratic Institute agreed to observe the elections under military rule, unlike the Organization of American States and the United Nations, which are still wandering in the realms of magic realism, refusing to join the United States in the real world. The overthrow of democracy in Honduras takes its place in deeply rooted and consistent policies and attitudes which trace far back. They trace back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, which essentially declared that the U.S. is sovereign in the hemisphere. Well, that couldn't be implemented at the time because of the British deterrent, but later it was as U.S. power increased and Britain's declined. And it's taken very seriously. When Cuba finally attained its independence in 1959, the United States reacted at once, within months, in fact, with significant terror escalated during the Kennedy administration and economic warfare. And the reasons were plainly stated in internal documents of the Kennedy-Johnson era. The reason was Cuba's successful defiance of American policies going back 150 years, that is, to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians, just successful defiance of orders. The warfare over these years has been carried out with quite incredible savagery and intensity. It's quite enlightening to look at the details. And also in opposition to the will of the public. Well, that's normal. But more interestingly, even in opposition to major segments of the business world. the pharmaceutical industries, energy industries, agribusiness, and so on. That's more unusual, and it's an indication of the importance of the state interest in punishing successful defiance. It's what we might call the mafia doctrine, one of the leading principles of international affairs. The Godfather does not tolerate disobedience for good reasons. It might spread and the system of control might erode. The basic outlines of policy were outlined with regard to Latin America, were outlined by the National Security Council in 1954. I'll quote their document. The primary threat to U.S. interests in Latin America is posed by radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. These tendencies conflict with the demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. Ours, though by accident they happen to be somewhere else. A large part of subsequent history flows from these unchallenged conceptions. Honduran President Zelaya was beginning to challenge these fundamental principles. The New York Times reported with unusual clarity that the coup reflected a yawning political and socioeconomic divide. For the small upper class, Zelaya was becoming a threat to what they called democracy, namely the rule of the most powerful business and political forces in the country. The New York Times account is quite accurate. He was initiating such dangerous measures as a rise in the miserable minimum wage in a country where 60% live in poverty. So plainly, he had to go. Honduras is a weak enough state and sufficiently under U.S. control so that it was possible to resort to the classic method of military coup, a coup, of course, concealed with polite rhetoric. Well, there's much more to say about imperial projects in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere, but I'll drop the matter, which I think Tariq will address in his talk today. Without further elaboration, as these examples illustrate, the progress towards a new world with more respect for peace and justice is not mirrored in the North. And much the same is true internal to the rich countries. We've just witnessed the dramatic collapse of the neoliberal policies that have wrought havoc in the South and also in the rich countries insofar as they've been applied, limited ways. In the United States, real wages for the majority of the population have stagnated or declined for 30 years, while economic growth has found its way into very few pockets, bringing about the worst inequality, at least since the 1920s, perhaps ever. That's one of the many harmful consequences of the substantial shifts in international economic policies from the 1970s, when the post-war Bretton Woods system was abandoned and the financialization of the economy began its grim course. At the beginning of this process in the United States, financial institutions accounted for perhaps 3% of gross domestic product. Now it's about a third. An important concomitant was the hollowing out of the productive capacity of the domestic society. Boeing and Airbus now virtually monopolize commercial aircraft production, and one of the more comical performances in the World Trade Organization is their constant battle about which one gains more state support in our free market economies. Boeing is a virtual offshoot of the U.S. Air Force and NASA, the space agency. It's now transformed itself into largely a managerial operation. It supervises the production of parts abroad. Similarly, the Obama administration, which has pretty much taken over the auto industry, is helping it to dismantle manufacturing plants, destroying the lives of the workforce and communities, while the Secretary of Transportation flies to Europe to use federal stimulus money to obtain contracts for the high-speed rail transport that the country desperately needs and that could be built by the skilled workforce in the plants that are now being dismantled, but with less profit for the financial institutions that increasingly govern the society. Actually, there was an interesting illustration of that just this morning. The Ford Motor Company is thinking of dismantling plants in the United States and transferring them right across the border to Canada. A very similar society, but different in some respects. One is that it has a more or less rational health care program. In the United States, health care is about twice the per capita cost of other industrial countries and some of the worst outcomes. And it's the only privatized system with very little regulation. Two factors, of course, correlate. And it costs auto companies $1,000 or more a year to produce a car in Detroit and across the border, largely because of the healthcare costs. And right now in Washington, the insurance corporations and the financial institutions are exulting because they have succeeded in preventing any meaningful change in the healthcare system, and one effect is further transfer of productive production from Detroit to, say, Windsor, Canada, right across the border. The connections are obvious, but rarely drawn. The collapse of the financial institutions and also the collapse of the reigning doctrines of efficient markets have posed no long-term problem, except, of course, for the general population. The primary agents of the collapse were at once selected by President Obama to put some bandages on the wounds, and they performed their task admirably. The banks and the investment firms are delighted with their performance. Profits and bonuses have risen to historic heights thanks to the huge public bailout and the success of the masters of the universe in undermining any thought of meaningful regulation. There were some fears that the Senate might venture into this dangerous territory, but the fears were overcome 2 days ago when the Senate Banking Committee surrendered to business power. So any thought of minor regulation is now out the window. The biggest firms, like Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase, are even bigger than before and are able to drive out competitors thanks to the government-organized mergers and their privileged access to cheap credit, all backed with a significant expansion of the government insurance policy, which is called too big to fail, that enables them to make risky and hence profitable transactions without undue concern about consequences because they'll be bailed out. Accordingly, they are prospering while regional and community banks, which serve the public, are struggling and steadily failing, so the business press informs us. Actually, the scandal has reached such proportions that the leading business weekly, Business Week, ran a cover story with the title Wall Street versus America. They were reviewing how sharp lawyers and investment firms managed to cheat cities, towns, pension funds, and other public entities of billions of dollars with deceptive claims and hidden conditions, leaving wreckage in their wake, all within the law, such as it is. The too big to fail government insurance policy exacerbates an inherent inefficiency of markets. In a transaction, The participants look out for their own welfare, but they ignore what economists call externalities, the impact on others. So if it's well managed, Goldman Sachs takes into account the cost to itself if a loan fails, but it doesn't take into account what's called systemic risk, the effect throughout the financial system, which can be huge. In fact, as we've just once again seen, well, that's almost bound to bring the system down periodically. All of that is well known but ignored, and in any event, the powerful win. Alan Greenspan, who was the prophet of the religion that markets know best, did pronounce the words irrational exuberance during the tech boom of the late 1990s that he supervised. And he's been criticized since for not following through to do something about it, particularly when the tech boom was followed by an $8 trillion housing boom, which somehow escaped the notice of the Federal Reserve Bank that he headed, as well as almost all economists. But it's the wrong criticism. It's completely rational exuberance when the government is there to bail you out. The basic insight was provided by Adam Smith. He pointed out that the principal architects of policy in England, in his day that was the merchants and manufacturers, he said they make sure that their own interests are carefully secured by the policies they design, however grievous the impact on others, including the general population. Much has changed in the past 250 years, but Smith's maxim retains its force, and we're seeing it today. The same is true of fundamental market inefficiencies. They remain. By now they are so severe that they suggest a revision in the guiding theme of the early global justice movement, the theme that a better world is possible. By now we have to ask whether a world is possible at all, at least a world in which there's some hope for decent survival. The predictable failure of the Copenhagen Conference brings that question to the fore quite ominously. The masters of the universe have announced publicly that they will do everything they can to undermine even mild energy and environmental legislation in the United States. And their intense propaganda has been extremely successful. In the United States, concern over global warming has dropped very sharply during the past year due to intense business propaganda. Most people are just confused. By now, barely a third of the population think that human activity contributes to global warming. Well, the masters understand, as well as the scientific community, that their actions may lead to a terminal crisis and that the world that they mostly own may well be destroyed. But their choices are quite rational within the reigning institutional and doctrinal systems. The goal is short-term profit and market control. The fate of the species can be dismissed as an externality, and those who refuse to play that game are likely to be forced to abandon it. The term capitalism is hardly appropriate for the prevailing systems designed by the architects of policy, systems that socialize cost and risk and privatize eventual profits. But the fundamental market deficiencies remain, and they are well implanted in the political economy, and the power of concentrated capital has predictably lethal impact. Unless the global justice movement is able to show that a new world is possible, and soon, the opportunity to do so may be lost forever.